Let's get started. Story number 1.
The cold was relentless, biting through Ethan's thick coat as he stepped out of his car. The road leading to his grandfather's old cabin was barely visible under the fresh snowfall, the surrounding woods eerily silent under the weight of winter. He had arrived later than planned, delayed by work and worsening weather. Now, standing in the empty clearing, he wondered if this had been a mistake. The cabin hadn't been used in years, not since his grandfather passed. Still, the structure stood strong, a solitary beacon of familiarity in an otherwise desolate forest. Ethan exhaled, watching his breath swirl into the air before disappearing into the night. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the old wood groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but the layout remained unchanged. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and dark. A few chairs sat around a wooden table, untouched. Ethan set his bag down and quickly went to work lighting a fire. Soon, the crackling flames cast flickering shadows against the walls, offering a small sense of warmth. He pulled out his phone. No service, of course. Sinking into one of the old chairs, he let the silence settle. The wind howled outside, causing the window panes to rattle. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Otherwise, the night was still. Then came the knock. Ethan's head snapped toward the door. 3 soft raps. His stomach tightened. No one should be out here. For a long moment, he sat frozen, listening. Maybe the wind had knocked a loose branch against the door? That had to be it. Then, another knock. This time, louder. Ethan stood, heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, but his rational mind urged him to check. Slowly, he moved toward the door, gripping the handle with clammy fingers before pulling it open. Snowflakes whirled in the wind, but no one was there. The clearing stretched out before him, empty and undisturbed. The snow on the porch was smooth, no footprints. Ethan swallowed hard and shut the door, locking it this time. His heartbeat thudded in his ears as he backed away, glancing at the window. Then he saw it, a single handprint. On the inside of the glass, his breath hitched. The print was small, like a child's, the condensation around it still fresh. Ethan whipped around, scanning the cabin. Nothing had changed, no movement, but the air felt heavier. A deep chill settled in his bones, colder than the winter outside. He took slow steps toward his bag, his fingers itching to grab his keys and leave. Then, from the far corner of the cabin, something shifted. A whisper, faint, almost pleading. Ethan spun, eyes locked on the shadows beyond the fireplace. His breath quickened. He strained to hear, was it the wind? No, it was a voice, and it was inside the cabin. He grabbed his bag, his hands fumbling for the keys. The whisper came again, closer this time. Help me. Ethan's blood ran cold. He backed toward the door, his shaking fingers struggling to undo the lock. Then, movement, a shape. In the dim glow of the fire, just at the edge of his vision, something stood near the corner of the room. Small, still, watching. Ethan's breath came in short gasps as he yanked the door open and bolted into the snow. He didn't stop, didn't dare look back until he reached his car. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition, his lungs burning from the freezing air. The engine roared to life. Only then did he glance toward the cabin. Through the window, past the frost and shadows, he saw it. A face. Pale. Hollow eyes. Still staring. Ethan hit the gas, tires spinning against the snow as he tore away from the clearing. He never returned to the cabin. But that winter, and every winter after, when the nights were longest and the wind carried whispers through the trees, he knew he wasn't the only one listening. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the frozen trees, rattling the old cabin's windows like bony fingers trying to claw their way inside. The world outside was swallowed by darkness, interrupted only by the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the deep snow. Adam pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The storm had rolled in faster than expected. He had planned for a quiet weekend alone in his grandfather's cabin, hoping to escape the noise of the city. Instead, he found himself stranded in the middle of a relentless blizzard with only a dying fire and the unsettling sense that he was not alone. It started with small things, the creak of the floorboards when he wasn't moving, a shadow shifting in the corner of his vision, the distinct sensation of being watched. He blamed it on exhaustion at first, brushing off the eerie atmosphere as paranoia. But then, the whispers started. At first, he thought it was the wind, a trick of sound created by the storm's fury. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew clearer, low, urgent murmurs just beyond the edge of comprehension. He sat up straight, his breath visible in the cold air. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse. The whispers stopped. Silence pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. He let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head. "Losing my mind," he muttered. Then the knock came. A single, deliberate knock on the cabin door. Adam's stomach twisted. No one should be outside in this weather. He hesitated, staring at the door, his heart hammering in his chest. Another knock, louder this time. Forcing himself to move, he approached the door slowly, every step feeling like a mile. He took a deep breath and pulled it open. Nothing, just the swirling snow and the trees bending against the wind. Adam exhaled, relieved and unsettled. He closed the door and locked it. As he turned back toward the fire, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the middle of the room, stood a figure. A man, or at least something that had once been a man. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and black. He was dressed in ragged, frost-covered clothing, his lips cracked and blue. "You shouldn't be here," the figure rasped. Adam stumbled back, crashing into the door. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Who are you?" he stammered. The figure stepped closer. The air around him grew colder, the fire dimming as if retreating from his presence. "He let me in," the figure whispered. "He let me in, and now I'm trapped." Adam's shaking hands fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was ice cold under his fingers, frost creeping along the edges. The figure tilted his head. "Don't let him in." A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the walls. The lantern flickered violently before going out completely, leaving only the faint embers of the fire. A sound came from outside. A voice. "Let me in," it whispered. Adam's breath hitched. It was the same voice as the figure standing before him. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin, swirling around him like the wind outside. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands against his ears. "Don't listen," the figure warned. The voice outside became more insistent. "Please, let me in. I'm so cold." Adam's body trembled. It sounded so desperate, so human. He felt the pull to open the door, to help. His fingers hovered over the lock. A sharp, cold hand gripped his wrist. "Don't," the figure hissed. Adam's eyes snapped open. The figure's black eyes burned into his. "If you open that door, you take my place." The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. This thing inside the cabin, it had once been a man who had made the mistake of opening the door, a man who had let something in. Adam's stomach twisted in horror. The knocking grew more frantic, the voice outside wailing now. The sound was inhuman, layered with something ancient and hungry. Adam yanked his hand away from the lock and stumbled back. The wind screamed. And then, silence. The figure let out a breath, his body flickering like a dying flame. "You chose right," he murmured. The frost on the walls began to melt. The warmth of the fire returned, casting shadows that no longer felt menacing. Adam blinked, and when he looked back, the figure was gone. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy silence. When morning finally arrived, Adam cautiously stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerily pristine landscape. He turned toward the door and froze. There in the snow were footprints leading up to the cabin, but none walking away. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The snow had started falling just before dusk, blanketing the narrow road leading up to the cabin. Michael drove slowly, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the thick flakes from blinding him. He hadn't planned to stay at the old family retreat so late into winter, but he needed time away, time to think. The stress of the last few months had weighed on him, and there was something about the isolation of the woods that felt almost comforting. By the time he arrived, darkness had fully settled in. He parked the truck beside the small, rustic cabin, the headlights illuminating the frost-covered porch. The place had been in his family for generations, though it had gone mostly unused since his grandfather passed away a few years ago. As he stepped out, the cold bit at his skin, sharp and unforgiving. Michael unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping the light switch. A single bulb flickered to life above the wooden table in the center of the room. It was just as he remembered, simple, untouched. He set his bag down, shaking the chill from his jacket, and went straight to the fireplace. It took some time, but he finally got a fire going, the warm glow casting flickering shadows along the walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, making the old wood creak. He sat back in the worn-out armchair, staring into the flames, allowing himself to finally breathe. Then he heard it, a soft knock. His head snapped toward the door. It had been faint, so faint that he questioned whether he had imagined it. The wind, maybe? He waited, his pulse quickening. Another knock. Louder this time. Michael frowned. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the road had been nearly impassable. He stood slowly, making his way to the door, pausing just before reaching for the handle. "Hello?" he called out. Silence. He cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the snow stretched out untouched, glistening under the pale moonlight. No tracks, no signs of anyone. His breath hung in the air as he shut the door, locking it this time. His grandfather used to tell stories about this place, old tales about the woods, about spirits that wandered in the winter. Michael had never put much stock in them. But now, standing alone in that cabin, something about those stories felt different. The night dragged on. The wind outside grew stronger, howling through the trees like a chorus of distant voices. Michael tried to ignore it, tried to lose himself in the book he had brought, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then the knock came again. 3 sharp raps against the wood. Michael's heart pounded. He stood up, this time grabbing the fire poker from beside the hearth. He moved toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. He took a deep breath, yanked it open. Nothing. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a deep, unnatural silence. Michael stepped onto the porch, gripping the poker tightly. His boots crunched against the snow as he scanned the tree line. Still no footprints. A gust of wind cut through him, and he turned to head back inside. Then he saw it. The window. Frosted over except for one clear patch, one perfect handprint pressed against the glass. Michael felt his stomach drop. That window was on the inside. He spun, rushing back into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt weak, like it was losing a battle against the cold seeping in from the walls. His eyes darted around the room. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked different. But the air had changed. Then, in the reflection of the window, he saw it, a figure, standing behind him. He turned sharply, fire poker raised. The room was empty. His breathing was ragged now, his mind racing. He needed to leave. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe stress, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to get out. He grabbed his bag, shoving his belongings inside, his hands shaking. Then the whisper came. Low. Close. Right beside his ear. Stay. Michael spun again, nearly tripping over the chair. Nothing. The air was freezing now, his breath visible in the dim light. The fire was barely flickering, as if something was sucking the heat straight out of the room. He didn't waste another second. He tore open the door and ran to his truck, slipping on the ice as he scrambled inside. His fingers fumbled to start the ignition, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The truck roared to life. He glanced back at the cabin. Through the window, past the frost, something was watching him. A figure. Silent. Unmoving. Then, as the headlights illuminated the front of the cabin, he saw them. Footprints. Leading from the door, but none leading away. Michael didn't wait to understand. He slammed the truck into gear, tires spinning against the snow as he sped away from the cabin, away from whatever had been waiting inside. He never went back. Story the end.